We now move on to Amendment 36, which is in the name of Brid Smith, Jean O'Kenny, Richard Boyd Barrett, Ruth Coppinger, Paul Murphy and Mick Barry.
Okay, well maybe if I hear some arguments back, might be convinced to the contrary, but this looks to me like a restriction that is incorrect in the spirit of dealing with fetal life that's incompatible with life outside the womb. Because how can one determine that this is okay up to 28 days, but if it lives, it might live 29 or 30, or it's okay for 4 weeks, but it might only live 5. I mean, I just think that the amendment which states to remove either before or within the 28 days makes it, this is not a good word for it, but makes it cleaner, makes it clearer that what you're dealing with is life that may be incompatible, or a fetal life that may be incompatible with afterbirth. So I just, that's why we moved the amendment to remove that either before or within 28 days. And if the Minister comes back and argues something that gives me more clarity, then I'm happy to be convinced.
Thank you, Deputy Smith. Minister?
I'm happy to do my best to provide Deputy Smith with clarity. Whether she should agree with my clarity or not, I don't know. But I mean, if you remember, Deputy Smith, before the referendum, when we published the general scheme in March, we defined this issue as shortly after birth. And I suppose the policy intention there, I think we all understood it. I certainly felt I understood it as a policymaker. This was to ensure that the issue of fetal abnormalities could be dealt with in our country, that the arguments put forward by groups like TFMR could be addressed. And we all, those of us campaigning for a yes vote, very clearly and determinedly showed that there was a difference and argued that there was a distinct difference between this and a disability. And I would have felt there was an effort by some to muddy those waters. So what we're talking about here is fetal abnormalities, to use that phrase. I know that's not the medical or legal phrase, but that's I think the way we all understand it. If you're going to have that, you do have to have an end period. You do have to have a period of time. And when I would have met with clinicians, mainly after the referendum, and indeed legal advisors in the Attorney General's office, really what was clear to me was there were 2 periods of time to choose from a policy perspective. The perinatal period or the neonatal period, the 7 days or the 28 days. And I opted for the 28-day period. Now, I would make the point, and I think, I don't wish to speak for you at all, but I think this is probably where you and others may be coming from. How can you know with absolute certainty that within 28 days, and how will a doctor interpret that? And I think that's the key question we're trying to get at, or certainly a number of people are. And I suppose I would answer that by saying the legislation says in the reasonable opinion of and formed in good faith. So these are still clinical decisions, and I'm not going to do anything, and indeed you're certainly not asking me to, but I'm not going to do anything in legislation that means that I or us as legislators prescriptively decide that. But I do need to provide a time period for guidance for our doctors. So we're saying to our doctors that if you believe that this baby, because it is at this stage, that is not viable, would not live outside the womb for 28 days, in your reasonable opinion, it is legal to provide termination services in this country. I do worry, and I'm not suggesting this is your intention at all, Deputy Smith, I genuinely don't believe it is. If we had no time period, we would have a very peculiar situation, because we would be saying that this is only for fetal abnormalities, but we'd also be saying it's for fetal abnormalities that may not be that fatal. So I think we're getting into a broader range of conditions here, and I certainly promised the people of Ireland that disability wasn't a ground, and I'm not suggesting Deputy Smith is endeavouring to, I'm genuinely not suggesting that at all, but my worry would be that would be an unintended consequence. So I do think we have to provide our doctors with clarity. I do believe, and I haven't received any information to the contrary from any doctors, masters or clinicians that they're unhappy with this period of time. In fact, quite to the contrary, that this was a welcomed clarification that was provided in the July general scheme that wasn't in the March general scheme. So that's where I'm coming from with it.
Thank you, Minister.
The Minister a question that maybe others would like to come in as well. You see, we've dealt with a lot of amendments here where the Minister refers to both the legislation and the guidelines, the medical guidelines, and how we need them to marry or to complement each other. And my point here would be that that should be a medical guideline rather than in legislation. I'm not against medics having advice or guidance or their science informing them, absolutely not. But it should not be in legislation, because in there you then risk the outcome of what you've just argued for previously, which is the criminalisation of medical practitioners who breach this legislation. So I think that this should not be in a legislative statement, it should rather be a medical guideline.
I others want to get in, but just because I think this is useful clarification. So the reason I'm putting this in is to provide much wanted and sought clarification by the medical community. So that's just to be clear, and also legal clarity. So the scheme I published on the department's website on the 28th of March required certification of a condition affecting the fetus that is likely to lead to the death of the fetus either before birth or shortly after birth. And actually asking, doctors understand what a neonatal period is. They don't understand with as much clarity, and nor should they, what shortly after birth is. So actually they wanted a sense from us as legislators as to what that period we're talking about is, and we're talking about the neonatal period. Now, I take the point Deputy Smith makes, and I take it seriously. And it comes back to, again, I suppose, the reference to the chilling effect and the likes. I don't believe there is any here, and I don't believe medics believe there's any here either, though I'm open to any one of them correcting me, I'm sure, because it says in the reasonable opinion of. So we're trusting the clinician to make the decision that it's appropriate to terminate. And we're not asking, so we are trusting their medical, clinical opinion, and indeed that of a colleague in this situation, because under the head it requires 2 doctors. And obviously, and another thing I suppose we haven't talked about much today, but obviously it's an obvious one, also the judgment of the mother. So we're actually talking about 3 adults, the mother, and remember in this case a much wanted pregnancy, with the devastating news of a fatal fetal abnormality, and 2 doctors, all believing in the reasonable opinion that this is the appropriate course of action. But, not to go on, but the neonatal period, 28 days, is a term that's understood in the medical community and welcomed by the medical community, as opposed to shortly after, which is a, words that we can use in here. So that's genuinely where we're coming from on this. I'm happy, and I'm sure you're in touch with clinicians for you to seek guidance.
I mentioned chill factor. Forget I said that.
Okay.
Just talk about the actual substantive argument, which is this should be a clinical guideline, not a legislation. So
they believe. So I'm sorry, I'm hogging the thing here. So just to say in response to that, and then I'll shut up. The legal clarification that I received was that shortly after was too vague, and also, in conversations I had with medics, including senior medics in this country, they welcomed and indeed sought greater clarity in our legislation. So yes, they have to do their guidelines, but their guidelines have to be based in the law, anchored in the law. And shortly after, in their view, and indeed in mine, is too vague to provide them with that anchor. So that is where it came from. Now, if between now and report stage people come forward with contrary views, but I feel pretty robust on this one, that it is an appropriate period of time, that it provides legal certainty that shortly after didn't, that it doesn't provide a substantive difference to what we were all aiming to achieve, and that it also provides a period of time, the neonatal period, that medics understand.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Donnelly.